This morning we're going to continue the story of Samson. Last week we looked at chapter 13, which is about Samson's birth. So I'll say a little bit about that, and then we're going to go on to chapter 14. And while we're doing that, I'll pass out pledge cards for the building of the new educational wing. So last time, remember, we looked at the birth of Samson in Judges 13. And I tried to make the point that this is a really unusual story because aside from Moses and then later on Samuel, this is the most amount of attention that we've been given to the birth of a particular figure, certainly the most attention we've been given in the book of Judges. And there's a reason for that. And that is that it's clear here that Samson in this story is supposed to represent Israel. That is, as we read about him, we're not just simply reading about an individual and what he does, but he reflects the condition of Israel. So we want to pay attention to that. And so two things about his birth. Remember, his mother was infertile, but God visits his mother and father and allows Samson's mother to conceive. So this is something of a miraculous birth. And from his birth, remember, Samson is under a Nazirite vow, a vow of dedication to accomplish some purpose. The unusual thing here is that Samson's whole life is now enveloped by this Nazirite vow. And that gets us into chapter 14. So the thing that we want to notice here in chapter 14 is a lot of things happen, but they all fall under the same category. So let's look at the story like this. Samson has been radically blessed by God. His mother, who was infertile, is enabled to become pregnant. He's been blessed with his Nazirite vow. We've already been told that he's going to deliver Israel from oppression by the Philistines, so he has like a great vocation in front of him. And from the moment chapter 14 opens and takes off, one thing essentially happens. Samson takes everything that he's received from God and squanders it. And in that way, right, he is supposed to represent Israel herself. Israel, who has this covenant relation with God, who's been gifted by God with so much, and now is in the process of like squandering everything she's been given. So let's take a look at it. A lot of things happen, but I think you'll see the message pretty easily. So here's how the story begins in 14:1. Samson went down to Timnah, and at Timnah he saw one of the daughters of the Philistines. Then he came up and told his father and mother, "I saw one of the daughters of the Philistines at Timnah. Now get her for me as my wife." So here we have something like fairly foolish, like right off the bat. Samson goes to the town of Timnah in Philistine territory. He sees this woman and immediately decides that's the woman he wants to marry. And so he comes to mom and dad and it basically says, "Me want woman, you get for me." Now his father tries to play the role of, like the wise father, and reminds Samson of something that's really important. But his father and mother said to him, "Is there not a woman among the daughters of your relatives or among our people that you must go and take a wife from this uncircumcised Philistine?" So two things happen right off the bat that are like clearly wrong. Thing number one, back in Deuteronomy, the law of Moses makes it clear the people of Israel are not to intermarry with the inhabitants of Canaan. What is the first thing that Samson wants to do? Marry a daughter of one of the inhabitants of Canaan. And second, all right, he's under a Nazirite vow, and he shouldn't be marrying until the vow's over. So what is the first thing he wants to do? Break his Nazirite vow. So basically, right off the bat, right before we basically know much or anything about Samson, we know that he's really not serious about the vow that he's supposedly living under. Once again, that too is supposed to reflect something about the people of Israel. The other thing that's at work here, right, is this. Remember, Samson's great vocation in life was to deliver the people of Israel from Philistine oppression. What is he proposing to do now? To marry one of them. That makes no sense. So things are really like off kilter, like right from the beginning. And here's the coup de grace here. In response to his parents' basically gentle warning, hey, you know, you really shouldn't be doing that because God's told us not to, right? In response to that kind of gentle warning, this is what Samson says in 14:3, and I think this is really important. Samson says to his father, "Get her for me, for she is right in my eyes." Now, that's important for a number of reasons, but one of the reasons is if you turn right to the end of the book of Judges, Judges 21:25, here's the last verse in the book, and it's significant. The last two chapters of Judges actually tells us about a series of absolutely horrendous events that occur because of Israel's unfaithfulness. We'll get to those. And after telling us about these horrendous events, here's what it says. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So here's the central problem. Here's the central problem with Samson. Here's the central problem with Israel. There's an insistence here on doing what one wants to do simply because one wants to do it. It doesn't matter that one's been in some sort of vow, in this case a Nazirite vow. It doesn't matter that God has explicitly forbidden something. Samson basically tells his father, look, I don't care what God said. I don't care what you say. I want her. I want what I want. And this is going to be an underlying theme of the whole story. That is, one of the underlying themes of the story of Samson is the dangers that occur when human desire is allowed to sort of run off the rails and not be disciplined or guided. Now, I think what we want to do is we want to take a step back from the story just for a minute, right? So we don't simply think that it's a story about Samson, and we also don't think it's a story about Israel too, right? It's a larger story about humankind. That's kind of what's really in view here, right? Remember what happens in the 3rd chapter of the book of Genesis. God tells the man and the woman that they're not to eat of the tree of the fruit of the middle of the garden. And the idea right here is, clearly, right, there actually might be like negative consequences to doing that, which is why God has like wisely put it off the table. Now, God's given you, like every other tree of the garden, God's given you one another, man and woman together. God's given you this wonderful vocation of taking and caring. The only limitation that's placed on you is the tree in the middle of the garden, and there must be some really important reason why that tree's been placed off limits. Maybe, just maybe, God is like wiser than you. That's essentially what the man and the woman refused to believe when they yield to temptation. It's not that they simply break a rule, right? It's not just simply that there's like a sign or like a little fence around the tree in the middle of the garden that says, you know, visitors to the garden are kindly requested not to eat the fruit of this tree under penalty of law or something like that. It's what they're really doing is they're questioning God's wisdom in forbidding it. We don't really care what you said. We don't really care whether this actually might be the wisest thing. We've been studying the fruit of that tree and we want it, and we intend to get what we want. And so I think there's an important comment here, right, about the fundamental nature of sin, right? Sin is not just simply people sort of like doing like naughty things now and then, although that's certainly part of it. It's actually something deeper. The thing that's going on with sin is that it's a matter of sort of like disordered desire. Disordered desire where we refuse to allow God and God's wisdom to act as a corrective. And so we get it into our minds, I want what I want, and nobody's going to get in the way of me having it. And that's basically the story of Samson. Samson's story is this continuous story of him demanding things and then going after them. And disaster resulting until the very end, and we'll see what happens when we get there. So he basically tells his parents, basically to shut up and to go get the woman for him. I think there's a little echo here of Jesus's story. We sometimes call it the parable of the prodigal son. I like to call it the parable of the prodigal father. Remember why Jesus tells the parable. Remember, Jesus has been eating and drinking with tax collectors and sinners, and the Pharisees come to him and say, look, you're soft on sin. You eat with these people that you shouldn't be eating with. There's something bad about them. They're tax collectors. They're bad. Sinners, they're bad. You should be like more careful and more have like a firmer cordon drawn around you. You clearly don't have a high view of sin. You're like a way out radical liberal that's out to undermine the moral fabric of the people of Israel. Blah, 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 blah. So Jesus says, oh, well, let me tell you a story. And the story, of course, is a story about sin, right? But remember how the story begins with the younger son who comes to his father and wants his inheritance now? Remember, right? How is it that you actually come to get an inheritance? Somebody's got to die, right? So basically, Jesus says, oh, you think I'm like a liberal and soft on sin? Well, here's what sin's like. Sin is like us coming to God our Father and saying, hey, buddy, why don't you just drop dead and give me what I want? Oh. That, too, I think I think there may be a sense in which Jesus has this story in the back of his mind as he's telling that parable. So here's how the story progresses. This is in Judges 14:5 and following. So we're going to get now to the marriage. Then Samson went down with his father and his mother to Timnah, and they came to the vineyards of Timnah. Okay, now remember, right? Part of a Nazirite vow is not drinking any alcoholic beverages. So what the heck is he doing in a vineyard? Right? You know, it's like the joke about, Baptists don't recognize one another in the liquor store. They pretend they don't know one another. What is a guy under a Nazirite vow doing in a vineyard? It can't be good. And behold, a young lion came toward him roaring. Then the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and although he had nothing in his hand, he tore the lion to pieces as one tears a young goat. But he did not tell his father or his mother what he had done. And when he went down and talked with the woman, and she was right in Samson's eyes. By the way, notice, we're never told what the woman thinks of him. That's not mentioned. After some days, he returned to take her. So, in effect, right, he goes to Timnah, makes the marriage proposal, goes back to his hometown. Now he's coming to get the bride. After some days, he returned to take her, and he turned aside to see the carcass of the lion. Behold, there was a swarm of bees in the body of the lion and honey. He scraped it out with his hands and went on, eating it as he went. And he came to his father and mother and gave some to them, and they ate. But he did not tell them that he had scraped the honey from the carcass of the lion. So here's another really important dimension of the story. Now, we've seen before, right, that God sent his Spirit on Samson. And the reason why God's done that is so that Samson can deliver Israel from the oppression of the Philistines. What we find over and over again is that Samson does not use that strength to actually to use it for the purpose it was given. He squanders it. And this is his first act of squandering. But he encounters this lion. And basically he says, "I'm not afraid of a lion." And he prepares to tear the lion apart. And then he says, "See, this is what happens when you drink protein shakes or something like that, or get a premier membership. This is what you can do." Then on the way back to Timnah, he finds the lion's carcass. And bees have gone into the carcass and they've built a hive, and there's now honey. And Samson reaches his hand in the carcass and now is eating this honey. Now remember, right, once again, in Judaism, right, dead bodies are unclean. Samson's under a Nazirite vow, which means that as a Nazirite vow, right, you never, ever go near anything unclean. Notice what Samson does. He reaches his hand into a dead carcass, gets some of the honey out, and then takes it, and then remember what he does? He gives it to mom and dad. He gives them unclean, defiled honey, so they're unclean too. He apparently doesn't care. It doesn't matter. As I was reading the story, I was imagining, a particular brand of honey that you could maybe buy at Publix. All natural, organic honey grown from bees living in dead lion carcasses. It says so right on the label, right? Can you imagine there's probably a great future for that. But once again, right, we just want to notice something here, right? Samson doesn't really seem to care about any of this. It doesn't matter. And once again, this seems to be a way of saying, well, this is kind of where Israel is, right? She basically doesn't seem to care about who she is or what her mission is. It doesn't matter. Just like Samson. He wants what he wants. Then the story continues in 14:10. His father went down to the woman, and Samson prepared a feast there. For so the young men used to do. As soon as the people saw him, they brought 30 companions to be with him. All right, now, right, this tells us something else, right? The Philistines send these 30 companions to be with Samson. I think the thing that we're supposed to understand here, right, is these are not companions at all, they're monitors. The 30 people that are around Samson are to keep an eye on him because he's perceived as being dangerous. And Samson said to them, "Let me now put a riddle to you. If you can tell me what it is within the 7 days of the feast and find it out, then I will give you 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes," which is, by the way, a lot. In other words, this is sort of this is sort of like the modern equivalent of saying, okay, if you can guess this riddle, I'll send you into Saks Fifth Avenue for 2 hours, and I'll pay for whatever you get. That's kind of what he's putting himself in for. So obviously a lot is on the line here. But if you cannot tell me what it is, then you will give me 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes. And so they told him, "Put your riddle that we may hear it." And he said, here's the riddle. Out of the eater came something to eat. Out of the strong came something sweet. So they're supposed to guess what this is referring to. Of course, Samson already knows because he's just lived it. And in 3 days, they could not solve the riddle. Now, they're kind of getting a little nervous about this, right? The Philistines, they can't answer the riddle. And so they do the smart thing in 14:15. On the 4th day, they said to Samson's wife, who after all is a Philistine, "Entice your husband to tell us what this riddle is, lest we burn you and your father's house with fire. Have you invited us here to impoverish us? And when Samson's wife wept over him and said, "You only hate me. You do not love me. You put me in the middle of my people, and you have not told me what it is." And he said to her, "Behold, I have not told my father and my mother. And shall I tell you?" Which is kind of interesting, right? This tells us something about the nature of their marriage, you know? She goes to him and says, "Wait a minute. You're my husband. You haven't told me the answer to the riddle." And he basically turns to her and says, "Yeah, and I haven't told mom or dad either. Why should I tell you?" So there's a little bit of marriage counseling that needs to go on here that doesn't happen. So what happens is eventually she actually gets the answer to the riddle out of Samson, and then she tells the Philistines, and they come to Samson with the answer to the riddle. And so he now has to send them to Saks Fifth Avenue for 2 hours, and he's going to pay for everything that they pick up. And here's what happens. And the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and he went down to Ashkelon, another Philistine city, and struck down 30 men of the town, and took their spoil, and gave the garments to those who had told the riddle. In hot anger, he went back to his father's house, and Samson's wife was given to his companion, who had been his best man. So notice how the story ends, right? Once again, Samson yet again misuses the gift that God's given him. Okay? Notice, the gift is given to him to liberate Israel from Philistine oppression. Notice, Samson has not done anything to accomplish that end with all the gifts that God's given him. He's basically used his gifts basically to exact personal revenge, and that's exactly what he does here. In order to come up with the money to pay the bet that he made, he simply goes and murders 30 Philistine people and takes their possessions and then gives them to the people, the Philistines, who guessed, quote unquote, his riddle. And he goes back to his father's house without the wife. He leaves her there. Now, one more thing to say about this, and then we'll stop because we're about out of time. The story continues in 15, and we'll take a look at that next Sunday. But just one thing about I want to point out in terms of the ongoing story about Samson and the Philistine wife. After some days, at the time of the wheat harvest, Samson went to visit his wife, the woman that he left, with a young goat. So after leaving her, after, killing some people, in the next town, and then going back to his hometown without basically telling her anything, he shows up at her father's house, essentially with a box of candy and an arrangement of flowers, and says, "Honey, I'm back." This is a surprise to his father-in-law, who says, and her father said, "I really thought that you had utterly hated her, so I gave her to your companion. Is not her younger sister more beautiful than she? Please take her instead." So the father-in-law says, "Oh, I thought you'd left her. I gave her to other man, but I do have a younger daughter, and she's actually better looking than the first one. Would you like to take her instead?" Samson refused to take that. Once again, I just want to emphasize something here, right? There is a comical element in terms of the way that Samson behaves, right? But there's also a very non-comical element. The non-comical piece right here is, once again, Samson is driven by passions and desires which are wholly and completely self-centered. He's completely unmindful of his vocation. He's completely unmindful of other people. He's completely unmindful of the mission that he's been given to deliver the people of Israel from Philistine oppression. He simply pursues his own agenda because he goes after simply what he wants. And every time he does it, some disaster occurs. And we just want to kind of think about this, right? So think about another consequence here, right? What happens among people when they sort of like decline into a kind of like radical self-centeredness? Well, the story of Samson illustrates it, right? What happens, or one of the things that certainly happens, right, is that all human relationships suffer. Mom and Dad, I know that what you've just told me, it really is according to the law of Moses. And I really realize that probably what you've just told me is actually the wiser course of action, but I'm not listening. Wife, I'm momentarily displeased with your people, so I am marching off and going back home. And then, when I want to, I'm going to show up at your house and pretend like nothing happened. And then I'm going to be shocked and angry when you're upset. That is, the story's helping us to see, right, that one of the consequences of sin is that it destroys, corrupts, and undermines all human relationships. And this is what we're seeing in Samson, right? Samson becomes increasingly blinded by his own desires, and until the very end of the story, he's actually unable to sort of see the consequences of his own behavior. He genuinely really is unmindful of the chaos, the confusion, and the disaster that he's sort of like generating. He's kind of standing there and saying, well, you know, I'm just a big, strong Israelite hero. I can't understand why everybody else is so messed up. And I think in that, right, we're getting a wonderful but also like really tragic picture of of the dynamic of sin in people's lives. Well, next Sunday we're going to take a look at the story of Samson and Delilah, which I'll warn you right up front, although it's been portrayed as, you know, kind of a romance story, it is not a romance. Okay, the story of Samson and Delilah is not a romance. So just get yourself prepared for this. Samson is in love with Delilah. The love is not reciprocated, and we'll see how that ends up. We'll also want to see how Samson's career comes to a tragic end and what that says about the people of Israel. And then once we do that, we're going to take a look toward the end of Judges. Judges actually has sort of two epilogues. Just like it has two prologues, it also has two epilogues. And we'll get a sense of what happens in Israel as the book of Judges comes to its conclusion. And that's where I say, well, we're going to read a story that is not very upbuilding, not very uplifting, not a good story that you would want to introduce into Vacation Bible School. So please keep that in mind as we take a look at it. Yeah, Jim? Well, it doesn't really work out. Yeah. I mean, I think that what we're getting, and there's that kind of comment right there that basically Samson is acting on his own like individual desires, but the idea is that God's going to even use Samson's misdirected desires to bring about his own purposes. Yeah.